So we've had 33 different championship managers throughout this season, and in today's video we're going to be ranking them all from worst to best. Let's hop into it. So as you can see on the bottom of the screen, these are all the managers we've had in charge of championship clubs this season, and we're going to be ranking them by the following categories: awful, bad, average, good, very good, and manager of the season contender. Your manager from this season, or if you've had a couple of them, where would you personally place them into this tier list right here? We'll jump straight into the video though, and we'll start out with a fairly obvious one. Marcus Schopp goes straight into the awful tier. He was an unknown coming into the championship this season, taking over the reins from Ishmael, who had done so well with that Barnsley squad last season to guide them to a 5th place finish, but things quickly unravelled for both Barnsley and Schopp this season, ultimately winning just one game in charge there. And even that game they won against Coventry, I thought they were massively fortunate to go ahead and do so. So yeah, no questions about it. Marcus Schopp in the awful category. Poyraz Bargi, I'm going to be a little bit more lenient on. I'm going to chuck him into the bad category. To some degrees, Barnsley did get a little bit of a bounce after Aspargi came in, but nowhere near what they were after if they were chasing championship survival. Ultimately, he was inheriting the mess that was left over by Marcus Schopp, though, so I'd be a little bit more lenient on him, but still didn't cover himself in glory, and his Barnsley side weren't really all too much better, if we're being honest about this one. We're sticking with the bad managers at the moment because Chris Hughton goes straight into that awful category, and managers whose stock has dramatically fallen off in recent years. If we're judging what this Nottingham Forest side has gone on to do after Chris Hughton, he was the guy that was obviously holding them back at the start of the season. You know, Steve Cooper came in and inherited a side that was rock bottom of the championship, devoid of any sort of clear tactical plan or creativity. And they were really a misery to watch at the start of this season under Hughton. I don't think there's anything to say about that. Steve Cooper, straight in the manager of the season contender. For me, one of the 3 best managers this season in the championship to take Forest from where he did up to the playoffs, regardless of what happens for Forest now in this next playoff semi-final. Steve Cooper has to be in the conversation for manager of the season. He's been absolutely excellent. That meteoric rise, the fact that the points per game he's actually averaged with Forest this season, had he been their manager from the start of the season, Forest would have won the league this year, which is absolutely ludicrous. So yeah, no doubt about it, Steve Cooper, manager of the season contender. A manager who I'm going to put in the very good category, I'm going to go for Mark Robins at Coventry. Coventry's 2nd season back up in the championship. Very much could have gone either way. We usually see this with year 2 teams who have come back up to the championship. They either continue to build on their survival from the previous years, or it's a bit of a reset. You know, 2nd season syndrome is what it's known as. But Coventry have skipped past any of that really, and I think have been much better this time around. More consistency to their game. They tend to create a hell of a lot of chances, and had they been, dare I say it, a little bit more clinical, definitely could have been within a shout of a top 6 finish this season. The new contract that he signed recently, I also think is massive news for Coventry fans. So yeah, big fan of Mark Robins and the job that he's done there at Coventry. For me this season, I'd say he's done a very good job. A bit of a difficult one to judge is Grant McCann, because he was sacked at Hull and then ultimately relegated with Peterborough. But a lot of different circumstances coming into this season with Grant McCann really, and for me personally, I'm between average and good for Grant McCann. He was sacked at Hull when they were outside of the relegation zone due to new ownership coming in. Ultimately, he was relegated with Peterborough, but he was walking into a doomed scenario already. You know, they were pretty much down in the position that Darren Ferguson had left them in. So I don't think Grant McCann has done all too bad of a job this season. He helped secure Hull's survival in the championship, and I think going into next season, Peterborough fans are actually quite excited to see what the future holds for Grant McCann. So with the sacking and the relegation in there, I can't justify putting him much higher than average, but I wouldn't suggest by any means that he's been a bad manager this season. I think he's done his job to the best of his abilities this time around. Speaking of Peterborough managers though, Darren Ferguson, I'm going to have to chuck him into the awful category. We've seen what Grant McCann has been able to do with this same bunch of players since he's come in, and there is the feeling around Peterborough that had, they made that change earlier on with Darren Ferguson leaving, there's every chance Peterborough could have scraped survival in the end. They were the highest up out of the 3 relegated sides in the end, finishing in 22nd place. Grant McCann's managed to get a tune out of these players that Darren Ferguson just didn't seem capable of doing, and for me personally, judging by what McCann's got out of them compared to Ferguson, I have to chuck him into the bottom tier. Tony Mowbray at Blackburn's a really difficult one to judge because first half of the season they were playing like an automatic promotion side, pretty much averaging over 2 points per game. Second half of the season though, there was such a dramatic slump and fall off that they were playing like a relegation side with the points per game they were picking up and how much the goals actually went ahead and dried up. I'd still give Mowbray the benefit of the doubt though, and I'd still say that it's been a good year for him. Obviously his last year at Blackburn, if you were to say to Blackburn fans at the start of the season you were going to finish 8th in the Championship this time around, I think that all of them would have snatched your hands off. I myself had them finishing 20th this season. I really thought that Mowbray had sort of reached his maximum capabilities with this Blackburn squad. Didn't turn out to be the case. Shame how the second half of the season unfolded for Blackburn really, but overall I still think he's done a fairly good job with that Blackburn side and the sort of resources available to him this season, albeit the second half of the season was really disappointing. I'm not Blackpool's biggest fan, but I'd have to give Neil Critchley the benefit of the doubt, and I would say that he has been very good for Blackpool this year. 16th in their first season back up in the Championship. Apart from a couple performances early on in this season, Blackpool have never really looked like a side who would be in contention for relegation. They've been comfortably mid-table for the vast majority of the year, and even in the second half of the season when they started to pick up a little bit of momentum, I think around sort of February time, we were even talking about potential late playoff charge from that Blackpool side. So yeah, Neil Critchley, very good job this season with what he's had at his disposal. I don't think there's much dispute in that really. Fulham's Marco Silva, I'm going to put him in the very good tier. He's a tough one to judge, Marco Silva, because he's got an embarrassment of riches this season, but Fulham have been a cut above the rest of the Championship for the vast majority of the season, and Marco Silva has been able to get the best out of these forward players. This has been probably the best attacking side the Championship's ever seen with the amount of goals they scored. The only thing that maybe counts against him is this Fulham squad, I think, had it in them to do something truly great this season in terms of getting right up there in terms of, Reading's 106 point record. In the end, they sort of took their foot off the gas towards the end of the season, finished with 90 points. It did feel like there was a little bit more that could have been squeezed out of this Fulham squad, but Marco Silva's done his job fantastically. The only reason I'm not putting him in that top tier is because the resources he had available to him compared to some of the other managers who I am probably going to throw into that top tier. But yeah, Marco Silva done the job for Fulham this season, played some fantastic fluid football along the way as well, and I'm interested to see how he gets on in the Premier League with them next season. I'd be interested to know from you guys where Scott Parker ranks for you. I think for me personally, based on this season, I'd have him in the good pile. I wouldn't quite have him in very good. I certainly wouldn't have him in manager of the season contender. Parker, similar with Marco Silva, is working with one of, if not the deepest squads in the Championship in terms of the personnel that's been available to him this season, and although Bournemouth only finished 2 points behind Fulham in the end, I certainly don't think they've been as convincing over the entire season as Fulham have. After the January transfer window that Bournemouth had, I think there was a real necessity for Parker to get this squad over the line. He did go ahead and achieve that, albeit they did sort of limp over that finish line in the final few game weeks of the season. The fact that Forest ran them so close in the end was, dare I say, a little bit of a knock on Parker and how he sort of handled that squad in the second half of the season when they did have the influx of all the players coming in from January. But they had that fantastic unbeaten run at the start of the season, which, Parker needs to be credited for. A couple of tactical switches towards the tail end of the season, Kiefer Moore and his impact off the bench and things like that. But on the eye tactically, given the resources he's had available to him, he's done a good job to get Bournemouth promoted. but I wouldn't say very good based on a couple of those reservations that I've still personally got about Parker. And I'd be interested to see how he gets on next season at Bournemouth, where, you know, it's a total different ball game when he's not got everyone else sort of outgunned, as it were, with the resources. So that's going to be the real test for Parker and Bournemouth next season, which will be interesting. Gareth Rower at Millwall, I think, has done a good job to take Millwall on the cusp of a top 6 finish once again. There was the feeling that maybe they could have gone that extra mile, you know, had their away form been a little bit more consistent throughout the year, had they been maybe a little bit more daring in some of those away matches, and they hadn't been as reluctant to sort of sit on 1-1 draws and things like that, then maybe they could have accumulated a couple more points. But fantastically consistent at home. You know, the Den's been a real tough place. Not many sides have walked away there with 3 points this season, and I think he's done a really good job. Given the resources, once again, he's got them competing at the right end of the Championship, albeit it's not always the most entertaining football, you know, the most sort of easy on the eye and things like that. Rowett's done a good job with Millwall this season for me. I'd also say that Ryan Lowe has done a good job with Preston as well, considering where Preston were when he inherited the squad. Don't get me wrong, we still have been quite patchy throughout Ryan Lowe's tenure. I think that's a consequence of this not being his squad yet, and some of the personnel not fitting into his new system. But overall, we've been scoring more goals since Lowe's come in. We've picked up more points. We've been, you know, a top 10 side since Ryan Lowe has come in terms of points per game and things like that. And despite a few hiccups along the way, the football has been so much more enjoyable to watch. And I'm really fascinated to see what he's capable of doing after a full summer transfer window. We may as well stick with North End managers. Frankie McAvoy, I'm going to put him in the bad tier because, I mean, the football in general was really horrific to watch at times under Frankie, and I really feared that if we'd have stuck with him for the whole season, there was a real possibility that we could have been relegated. I think we were 18th or 19th in the table when we went ahead and sacked him, and it didn't feel like things were going to get any better under him. The only sort of redeeming factor that I suppose Frankie had throughout the season was there were a couple of results we picked up under him, you know, Bournemouth away, for example, and how he started to integrate Emil Rees into the starting 11 as well. So a few plus points for him there, but overall it was a pretty bad time with Frankie in charge, if we're being honest. Michael O'Neill at Stoke. I mean, he's been a victim of injuries and circumstances at times, but to finish bottom half with this Stoke squad from what was expected of them at the start of the season, I'm going to have to put it down as a bad season for him, if I'm honest. First few months of the season, Stoke were absolutely flying in the league. They were playing some wonderful football and had finally seemed to crack that sort of consistency that had been lacking from them in previous years. But they've slumped towards another bottom half of the table finish with how inconsistent they've been in the second half of the season when the injuries started to add up and things like that. Mismanagement of a few games in the second half of the season as well has ultimately led Stoke to what I would consider a really disappointing campaign. Lee Bowyer at Birmingham as well, I'd also say has had a pretty bad year. Don't get me wrong, he's fighting with a lot of other circumstances at Birmingham in terms of off-the-field issues and things like that, but there was, dare I say it, a little bit of positive momentum at Birmingham towards the back end of last season when Bowyer had come in, and there was the feeling that maybe he could capture some of that and start to build a platform for Birmingham to finally build up the Championship. In the end, that's not been the case, and I think that Birmingham have been quite thankful to other clubs getting point deductions this season. Otherwise, they would have seriously been dragged into a relegation scrap in the final few game weeks, which isn't great given the squad and personnel that they've got there for me personally. Valérien Ismaël, tough one to judge here. Not the most popular man at West Brom. I don't think he did a bad job there, though. I'm going to put him into the average tier. Now, West Brom were expected, bare minimum, to be a top 6 side this season. I had them down to finish second in the Championship after the season that he just had at Barnsley, the squad he was inheriting at West Brom. You know, the vast majority of this West Brom squad already achieving promotion in the previous season there. So everything seemed set up for Ismaël to walk in, add that sort of final dynamic to that squad with a couple of the players coming in as well, and they'd be there or thereabouts. And to be fair, for the first few months of Ismaël's tenure, tenure. That did seem to be the case. Ultimately though, a bad run of form towards the end saw the momentum start to spiral away from him. It didn't feel like he could sort of grab that back. The redeeming factor that Ismail has though is that West Brom were in the top 6 for pretty much the entirety of his tenure there. When he was sacked, West Brom was still inside the top 6. After Steve Bruce came in, that's when things started to torpedo downwards even more so. And for that reason, I think I'd chuck Steve Bruce into the bad tier. I think that Bruce has had a worse year for West Brom than Ismail did. And I know that Ismail wasn't popular. The football they played at times wasn't great on the eye and things like that. But other than when Ismail seemed to lose things towards the end, he had West Brom playing at a higher standard than Steve Bruce has, for me personally. So that's the defining factor between those two this season. Let's talk about a good manager next up though. And Nathan Jones, undoubtedly in that top category for manager of the season contender. I think there was a real feel-good factor around Luton this season. I had them down for a top 10 finish, but I don't think many people were as bold to say they'd go ahead and make it into the top 6, particularly considering some of the injuries that they've had in the last few weeks as well. The fact that they've been able to outdo some of those other sides who they've been up against in terms of budgets right here that we're talking about, in terms of a manager who's got absolutely every last ounce of talent out of his squad. No one has done it quite like Nathan Jones this season. I know they've had a few sort of hiccups throughout the year, you know, Fulham putting 7 past them, a couple of horror shows against Birmingham and things like that, but the general picture undoubtedly has Nathan Jones as a manager of the season contender. Wonderful manager. Based on this season, for Mick McCarthy, I'm going to have to chuck him into the awful tier as well. I genuinely think that had Cardiff sticked with McCarthy for the entirety of this season, they probably would have been relegated. They were on an absolutely dismal run of form, and I was shocked that they sticked with him for as long as they actually did. After they went on that, I think it was 8 consecutive game losing streak, they finally bit the bullet and got rid of him. But from what was expected of Cardiff at the start of the season, you know, maybe to go ahead and flirt with the playoffs once again, that just didn't materialise. They were conceding goals for fun, which was the real shock. Stereotypically, we consider McCarthy teams to be sort of quite stingy and resilient at the back, but that had completely gone out the window. The goals weren't being scored as well. You know, Kiefer Moore was sort of in and out of the side in the first portion of the season, and McCarthy just couldn't get a tune whatsoever out of this Cardiff squad, and the football was pretty awful as well. Now, as you guys know, at the start of the season, I was backing Middlesbrough for a top 6 finish. Under Neil Warnock, it didn't look like that was going to go ahead and materialise, and I think that by the standards that he has set for himself and the way that we thought this Middlesbrough side might go at the start of the season, Warnock and how he had that Borough side playing at the start of the year was quite the underachievement, really. It did feel like they needed to go ahead and make that change, obviously. Chris Wilder coming in, and overall, I think he's done a good job with Middlesbrough. Couldn't quite get them over the line in the end, and there probably will be matches that Borough fans look back on and think, God, we shouldn't have dropped points in that one, you know. The away performance at Barnsley, for example, the home loss to Hull, a couple matches in the run-in where Borough fans will be thinking maybe we could have picked up a few more points there. But in terms of overall performances, how they've improved under Wilder, I think Borough could be a real force going into next season. And judging off this season, I think Wilder's done a good job to get them back in the conversation as a top 6 club. Next up then, let's go for Reading's Veljko Paunovic. Where do I place him? I do have a little bit of sympathy for Paunovic because he was battling the scenario going on behind the scenes with Reading. Obviously, the point deduction wasn't helped at times by injuries as well, but at the worst of it, Reading were truly awful under Paunovic, and there was a real possibility that had they stuck with him, they would have been relegated. Defensively, absolutely all over the shop, and it even felt at times like they were sort of relying on a bit of individual brilliance from, you know, John Swift producing something. It didn't feel like a systematic thing that Paunovic was necessarily putting in place. They finished 7th the season before, and up until this season, I thought that Paunovic had done a decent job for Reading, but at this season, the football was pretty awful, to be honest. Although they did do the double over my side, North End. I think that his victory over North End was actually his last game in charge of Reading when they beat us at Deepdale. After that, Paul Ince came in. Interestingly enough, Paul Ince's points per game for Reading this season is only marginally better than Paunovic's was, and you know, Paunovic at times obviously had that disastrous run towards the end of his spell there, but ultimately Ince was brought in to keep Reading up in the Championship, and he went ahead and did that. I'm going to put him in the average tier because there still have been quite a few bumps along the road of Ince being in there, but ultimately he got the job over the line for what he was brought in to do. So I think around average is fair, to be honest. Mark Warburton, start of the season, you'd have had him in very good. Second half of the season starts to drift into bad and awful with how much they fell off. Once again, I do have sympathy for Mark Warburton for some of the things that transpired against him in the second half of the season. Don't get me wrong, he still got stuff wrong in that second half of the season, and ultimately is a little bit of a victim of his own success, really. But judging him off the standards that he has set for himself to finish lower this season than they did last season when the expectations had risen so much this season, I think is a little bit of a disappointment, really. So I'm still on the fence as to whether I think it was the right decision long term for QPR to move Warburton on at the end of this season, but this season in isolation, I'd say would be a pretty average one, to be honest, for Warburton, which was a shame, really, because he had them right in there amongst the playoff picture for the first half of the season. Jokanovic in at Sheffield United. Brilliant manager over the course of the jobs that he's done in the Championship previously, but at Sheffield United, I've got to say, pretty awful, to be honest. We've seen what Heckingbottom has been able to do with that same group of players, and we all knew that Sheffield United might have been a little bit of a slow burn coming into this season. The football that Jokanovic was trying to instill in the Sheffield United side was such a contrast to how they've been playing under Wilder in years before that, but he had them languishing in the lower parts of mid-table, which is well short of what we expected of Sheffield United this season. And after that, we had Paul Heckingbottom. And to be honest, I'm going to have to throw Paul Heckingbottom into the very good tier, I think. I think he's proved, myself included, a hell of a lot of people wrong. At the time when Sheffield United decided to give Heckingbottom the job, it was a decision that was met with quite a bit of mockery, to be honest, but since his appointment at Sheffield United, I think only Huddersfield and Nottingham Forest have picked up more points than Sheffield United have. Don't get me wrong, it was sort of a return to how we thought Sheffield United should have been performing this season under Heckingbottom, but it took him to get the tune out of most of these players, really. He took them over when they were around about 16th in the Championship, and if he does manage to get them promoted this season, fair play to him, because he's certainly been able to turn around that ship this season. Russell Martin in at Swansea. Do you know what? I think he's done a fairly good job, to be honest, considering everything that was going on at Swansea over the summer, the players they went ahead and lost, how he's been able to slowly instill a new philosophy of football. At times in the second half of the season, I think that some of the stuff that Swansea have been playing has been absolutely fantastic, and there has been more consistency to their game the more we've seen from this Russell Martin side. And I think that going into year 2 under Martin, I'm really excited to see what he could achieve with them. Wayne Rooney is going to be one for debate. For me personally, I think Rooney's done a really good job with Derby this season. I know they were ultimately relegated, but he was fighting against so much this season that, for me personally, I think he's done a really good job there. Tactically, I think for a lot of the season, he's got it spot on. Both times I've watched Derby live in the stadium against Preston, they've absolutely played us off the park for the most part of it. The youngsters that he's given opportunities to, I think that Derby have handed pro debuts to 9 different players this season. They barely had a semblance of a squad at the start of the season, and without that 21-point deduction, would have comfortably survived this year, which I think is a massive achievement in itself. People will always mock it and say, oh, but they were still relegated and stuff like that. And at times, Rooney has got things wrong. He is still a manager learning on the job. Their away form, for example, has been something that's, constantly hampered them throughout the season. But overall, considering what he was taking on at the start of the season, I myself think Rooney's done a really good job there, but I'm sure some people will have differing views on that one. He's definitely a point for debate. I think he's done a good job personally. Shota Valades in at Hull. I'm going to say average, pretty small sample size that we've seen him in charge of in this second half of the season. I think he's been in charge of 19 Hull matches. Obviously, they had a little bit of an influx of players coming in January, and it was up to him to sort of foresee Hull in this second half of the season and make sure they continue to tick over and get over the line, and ultimately he's managed to do that. But all about next season for him and Hull, really, to see how they can go ahead and build upon this season. Nigel Pearson in at Bristol City. I'm also going to throw into the average tier as well. I think there's not really been all too much of a threat of relegation for the vast majority of the season for Bristol City, but they never really threatened to do and go one better and start pushing up the Championship. Inconsistent has been the best word probably to describe Bristol City this year. They've actually scored more goals than any other side to finish outside of the top 6. Their problem has been keeping the ball out of the back of the net this season. So yeah, very much an up and down side. Bristol City had their fair share of highs and lows this season, and Pearson has probably contributed to that in what has been a pretty average year for them overall. Steve Morrison in at Cardiff. Do you know what, for the situation that he walked in at Cardiff, considering how they were playing towards the back end of McCarthy, what he had to take on, ensure that they got away from a relegation zone, and also considering that this is his first ever job as a manager as well, all things considered, I think he's done a pretty good job with what he's been working with and the general state of the club when McCarthy went ahead and left. For his first job, I think he's done a decent job, to be honest. It'll be interesting to see how he develops that Cardiff squad going into next season, though. They've obviously tried to do a few different things. Finishing it off then with Carlos Corberán, undoubtedly manager of the season contender. For me personally, those three right here have been a cut above the rest in terms of my personal three best managers this season. Carlos Corberán has proved, and myself included, a hell of a lot of doubters wrong. I think a lot of Huddersfield fans as well. And I know from speaking to a lot of Huddersfield fans at the start of the season, the jury was still very much out on Carlos Corberán. To me personally, last season it felt like Corberán was a good coach, but all the stars hadn't quite aligned for him to go ahead and play the brand of football that he wanted to at Huddersfield with the resources at the club at that time. And I think that this season, to be fair to him, he's been a lot more adaptable, and he's managed to strike that balance perfectly between defence and attack. Recruitment has also been a major part in this as well. But yeah, he's massively changed my perception of him this season, and the resources that he's been working on this season as well deserves immense credit for getting a third placed finish with Huddersfield when the vast majority of us thought they'd be battling relegation. So though that right there is my ranking for Championship managers this season. I want to get your guys' verdict on this one in the comments down below. Do you think I've been harsh on anyone? Do you think I've been too kind on anyone? Let me know down below if you personally disagree with any of these selections. There you have it though, guys. That will wrap it up for today's video. Plenty of talented managers in the Championship this season. I'd be interested to know your personal picks for who you think should be up there as a manager of the season. That will wrap it up for today's video though, guys. If you did go on to enjoy, make sure to leave a like and do stick around and subscribe for some regular Championship content. But with that, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.